Hello, Acts 29 family. My name is Kevin Scott. I am the planter and lead pastor of Church at the Well and the visionary founder of the Well Coffee Houses in Boston, Massachusetts. We've been here for 13 years. I moved here from California, and in the last 13 years, we've been able to help plant 3 churches and open 5 nonprofit coffee houses that help us build relationships and contextualize the gospel to our unique context here in Boston. Even though we find that we have different contexts and different challenges based upon the locations that we're in, what we do know is that we have the same mission. And what we find is that the effectiveness and impact of our mission is directly related to how well we contextualize our efforts to our area of ministry. And so what we're going to be looking at today is how we contextualize mission and why it is so important to do that. The issue is contextualization actually requires sacrifice. It's difficult at times. It requires that we let go of our preferences and comfort zones. It means that we have to be creative in the way that we think about ministry and flexible in the way that we do it. It means that we have to put others first. We have to focus on building relationships, and ultimately we have to make sacrifices that might lead to suffering. The good news is that we have examples from the early church of how they learned to contextualize their ministry so that the gospel was effective wherever they found themselves. And so when we go back in Acts, we've got to look at the overall picture here. So let's kind of catch up to where we are. We know that Pentecost has occurred, that Peter stood up and gave this amazing sermon that birthed the church, and the church began to grow. And we're given a descriptive narrative of what that early church looked like. But what we find is that over time, human nature sets in, and the church becomes comfortable with where it is. It's comfortable in its growth. It's comfortable in how it's functioning. It's comfortable in its fellowship. And it begins to neglect the mission that Jesus had given them. And so what does God do? He sends persecution. And if we go to Acts 11, what we find is that the stoning of Stephen becomes this fire and this fuel for greater persecution that pushes the believers out of Jerusalem to all other areas around, places like Cyprus and Antioch. And we find that those believers began to preach not just to the Jews, but to the Hellenists, to Greeks, to Gentiles that were there. And the Holy Spirit began to move, and individuals were getting saved, and the church began to grow, and they began to learn what it would mean to actually present the gospel in a way that was meaningful to the individuals that they were finding themselves in front of. And then we have Paul come on the scene. As we move forward in Acts, we know that Paul is called by Jesus to be a missionary to the Gentiles. And Paul becomes this perfect example of what contextualization looks like. But one very specific example in the book of Acts, when we look at Acts 16, 1 through 5, is Paul meets this individual named Timothy, a young man. And Timothy is born of a Jewish mom and a Greek dad, and he hasn't been circumcised. But as Paul is looking at the places that he's going to be going to do ministry, he realizes that taking Timothy with him, an uncircumcised individual, could place barriers to the gospel for the Jews that they're going to attempt to minister there. So he asks Timothy to make a sacrifice that ultimately leads to some suffering, as Timothy, being an older individual, is going to be circumcised and experience the pain and suffering that contextualization of the gospel is going to require of him. Like Timothy, we find that contextualizing the gospel to our areas of ministry is often difficult. But in Acts 13:47, we're given a command. It says, "For so the Lord has commanded us, saying, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." Acts 29, we've been given a mission. Like Timothy, oftentimes we're required or asked to make sacrifices that are going to help contextualize the gospel to those that we've been sent. What we have to remember is we have been sent on mission. And in order to see the mission become impactful, contextualization is required, and we need to think outside of the box creatively. We need to understand our people. We need to build relationships with those that maybe we wouldn't naturally associate with. We need to encourage our churches to be creative and relational and bold, and to step out in faith in areas that maybe aren't necessarily comfortable to them or for us. We are privileged to be on mission with Jesus. We know that He's the one that saves people. He's the one that changes lives. But He asks us to be a part of what He's doing in all of these areas that we minister. And so we have to ask ourselves, What relational, cultural, societal barriers lie between the good news of Jesus and the people that you've been called to impact and bless? And who in your context may need to hear the gospel in a different way? Acts 29, how can we be more creative? How can we make sure that we don't lock ourselves into comfort zones that limit the number of people that hear the gospel? Maybe it's going to look like opening a coffee house. Maybe it's opening a thrift store. But ultimately, we need to understand that the gospel needs to be taken to everyone. And in order to do that, it's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require creativity. It's going to require for us to be bold and to think uniquely. We serve a God that is capable of anything. Acts 29, let's commit to build new relationships, to reach new people, to plant new churches in areas that maybe we never thought was possible. Let's commit to contextualize the mission, because the mission of Jesus matters most.